Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of the third class. So earlier we were talking about searching in the Library of Congress Authority file, and we were talking about some of the ways that authority files work in terms of various searching. And so I wanted to talk a little bit more about that before we dive into authority records. So if I wanted to search for, say, rock groups and rock music, or if I wanted to, if I knew I wanted to search for like something related to rock music in Portland, Oregon, I could kind of construct that search really in any OPAC out there, provided that it can access that authority record information, and some of them can, some of them can't, then the information that we put into an authority record will actually bring up other terms and other results. So for example, if I were searching in OPAC and some of the variant terms that are related to a particular subject are in that authority record, if that library catalog can search that authority record and pull those variations or pull those see also references that we have used in the past, those are all related to variations. So most modern ILSs can do this to some extent or another. So they either link to an authority record or they make a copy of an authority record, but they can parse out some of that information. So for example, in searching for rock groups, rock music in Oregon, I get a list here of various bands that are related and musical artists, as well as a rock concert that's related to Oregon. And if I just pull up one of them, I pull up Radiation City here, you'll see that Radiation City, that's the name, that's the official name of the band. So this is their authority record in that 110. You can see right there, Radiation City, and the musical groups actually have that designation that they're a musical group, and that helps separate them from potentially other things. And those of you who may follow music, especially contemporary music, or indie bands, you know that there are a lot of names that overlap, and sometimes when you have names abroad, they'll tack UK onto the end of them or something like that to sort of separate out from a band here in the United States that has the same name. So, good ideas, people kind of have the same idea sometimes, and you'll have different bands with the same name. Of course, in authority record, we want to make sure that we can clearly designate the Chameleons in the US versus the Chameleons in the UK band, that we can clearly separate those out. Sometimes they will do it themselves. Chameleons UK will tack 2K onto the end of their name. Other times they won't do it, but we will do it when we make the authority record. So we will do something like tack on musical groups, or we may try to do something else to disambiguate or to separate out those two identities. Of course, this also has to do with whether or not they publish music and they get popular enough that libraries start collecting it. And so not every indie band is going to have an authority record, but as they publish music, as museums, archives, libraries collect those resources, then that's when they get to have an authority record. So when you look down here, we have 110 Radiation City Musical Group. So that's the name, that's their name. And then we have here rock groups. So that is their genre that they perform in, and you see that listed in the 368. And then you see there that we have Portland, Oregon. So we actually have a place that's tied with them. And so that's how we kind of pull together some of that other information. You'll also notice if you look down here in the 670, so the 670s is where we cite resources. And I'm not going to go too much into it, but I'll just say that when I first started cataloging, it was still a very big deal and a little bit controversial to use Wikipedia. So you were not to use Wikipedia as your only resource, but I think we've all come to accept Wikipedia as the resource that it is, and best practices are use additional resources and additional Wikipedia, but Wikipedia is considered to be a perfectly acceptable resource for authority. So if you notice down here, we also have Portland, Oregon, and some other areas too. So that gives us another way that we're looking at things. So in terms of our subject headings and in terms of how they're constructed, in a MARC record, the topical term, called the topical term subject added entry, that's quite a mouthful there. That term is goes how the 650 is defined, and the 650 is the field where we put those subject headings. So you'll remember when we were talking earlier about having the range, so 600 through 699, 650 has been designated as and defined as the place where we're going to put subject headings, and subject headings of a particular type. So when you have a MARC record, and we already talked a little bit about this, you have that first indicator and the second indicator. Those indicators do different things depending on what kind of field it is. So in a 245, which is our title field, the second indicator actually tells the system whether or not to index that title and then how to index that title. So indicators tell us different things in a MARC record. This is part of what makes a MARC record so hard for programmers and these sort of next-gen ILSs that are being built to work with, is because each field works a little bit different and not the same. So when you're looking at MARC fields, you really do have to look at some of the MARC resources that are out there, like bibliographic formats and standards, or the Library of Congress MARC guidelines. There's all kinds of MARC records and MARC examples out there. And I will share a cheat sheet with you of my own that I will share with you as well. But there's all kinds of MARC tools out there so that you can easily look things up. Bibliographic formats and standards is from OCLC, and it's a great way to search if you don't know what a MARC field is. So you can just type in with that MARC field, you could type in 650 and it'll pull up, you know, information about the 650, and it gets very technical, but you can clearly see what it is. And if you scroll down past that sort of that technical information at the top, you'll see examples too, and that's very helpful. So that's a very helpful resource, and it's in your resources at the end of the slides today. So that's a very awesome, great resource. Can't recommend it enough. Anytime you're working with MARC records, you can just pull that up, pop in anything you're not sure of. If you see a record in OCLC, or you see a record in somebody's catalog and you think, what field could that be? What field's that used for? You can just pull up your bibliographic formats and standards, pop in that field, and you'll see whether or not they've used it properly, which you may be surprised, but you also then see how it's defined and how it's used. So it's a great tool as a quick reference, and if you really want to get technical and learn some of the technical part, that's in there too. But the bottom part of each entry has great examples in it. So I can't stress enough what a great resource it is for looking up this kind of information. So 650, that's where we define in a MARC record, where we define our subjects. We actually, as I mentioned, we actually define the indicators. So for the 650 field, and remember, indicators work differently depending on what field it is, that's defined by the larger MARC oversight group. So there's actually this larger MARC committee that makes recommendations for how this is used, and they keep up with all of these indicators. So each indicator can be between 0 and 9 because it's a position-based thing, just like the range of fields for 6XX field. So it could be 600 to 699. The first indicator could be 0 to 9. Second indicator could also be 0 to 9. Now, we've not used all of those spaces, and we probably won't use all of those spaces at this point because we're looking at how we're going to move away from MARC. But for now, many of us are working in MARC records, and if you're working with a library catalog, you're probably working with MARC records. Either you're getting MARC records, or you're trying to get your data out of a MARC record, or you're getting ready to move to BibFrame or something else, or you're working with a digital library or another database and you're trying to move between MARC records, or maybe you get records from a different library catalog and you're trying to put them into your database and they're MARC records. So knowing more about the MARC and how it works is going to be very helpful for any of those scenarios beyond just sort of cataloging, sort of traditional cataloging using MARC records. So for our second indicator, for the 650, the first indicator is blank. That means there's no value assigned to it. You'll see blank represented as the pound sign. You'll see it as this sort of cursive B. Sometimes that's really old school. It's actually a typed character. Very old school, but usually you'll see it as a pound sign now, or sometimes you'll see it as an underscore if you're looking in a web-based browser, or you will even sometimes see it as just a space. So like in examples and stuff that people use, a lot of times we just space over one. So first indicator is blank, there's nothing assigned for that position. Second indicator tells us what subject authority we're using for that particular choice. So second indicator 0, Library of Congress subject headings, always. And if it's not a Library of Congress subject heading, somebody's misused that field. And that's a no-no. And in some cases, it will get caught in various resources out there. 650 second indicator 1, that's a special program for Library of Congress subject headings for children's literature. A second indicator 2, that would be those MESH or National Library of Medicine headings. And then 8 is 650 second indicator 8 is for Sears. And then of course within that, we've already talked about these. You have your form subdivision, your general subdivision, that's your general topical subdivision, a subfield X, a chronological subfield Y, geographic is subfield Z. So remember that when you're looking at records, unless you see a different subfield there, so for example in a 264 you might see if it's a 264 4 is your second indicator 4, then you're going to see a subfield C as your first subfield. But unless you see a different subfield, if you don't see any subfield when you're looking at a field, that means there's a subfield A that's been suppressed. So we're going to look at lots of examples. So lots of examples. So these are all examples of topical subject headings. And you'll notice here we have Jews, Russian. This inverted form of a subject heading is an older form, and I would say that the chances that it could be updated sometime in the future would be higher because it is an older form and formed in an older pattern. So because the Library of Congress subject headings have been around so long, since around 1898, somewhere around 1898, and they did all of their own headings. So, you know, that's a long time, a long time. So, you know, they did all of their own headings for a while. And then in the 1980s, which is still a long time ago, in the 1980s, they started working with other libraries. And so they have adapted how they have created their subject headings over the years. So one of the earlier ways that they did subject headings was to do this inverted form of a name. And of course, part of it was because of how things would file when you would do a shelf list card. So at one point we had card catalogs and you would actually have a subject card catalog. And so you would file by that name. So if you wanted to group, you know, Russian Jews together, then you would do it Jews, Russian. Now, of course, as we continue to look at especially demographic terms and we continue to look at how people want to be referred to and you know, whether or not we've built bias in our systems and how we can correct that and start addressing it, you know, some of these terms are probably going to just change as we continue down the road. And then of course you have here your subfield Z Germany, subfield X for history, and then subfield Y for 20th century. Sometimes you have subject headings that cannot be subdivided geographically, so you cannot add anything else to them. An example of that is love and mass media. That's considered to be sort of a general international term, and so, you know, it doesn't really have that, it doesn't really have that ability to be divided. So other examples that we can see here, we have chi, a fictitious character, and of course that can't be, people can't be subdivided geographically, although they may be related to a place. So that may be something we think about in the future as, you know, how do we associate place and people at the same time? But if you notice here, all the Z's, my little arrows have gotten off a little bit, all the Z's are the places where we would have geographic subdivisions. So talking about geographic names, they can be topical or subdivision. It really depends upon what your item is about. So when you're cataloging, that is the topic 20% of the work or more, and what is it when you look at the whole, what is it mostly about? And that is where we get, is it the topic, or is it going to be a subdivision? I talked a little bit about that in the earlier class when we're looking at a book that is a history of Atlanta. So it's about Atlanta mostly, or primarily about Atlanta, versus a book that is on emerging technology industries in Atlanta. So it's really more about the technology sector, and it just happens to be about Atlanta, related to Atlanta, sort of secondary. So thinking about that, headings can be assigned for jurisdictional areas and for geographic features. So it's one of those things that when you're cataloging and you have something, maybe you have a map of the Grand Canyon, or you have a map of a local park, or some kind of hiking trail or something like that, your first thing you're going to do is look to see what subject headings may be available for you in terms of that. Is it set up as a geographic feature or as a place itself, or will you look at that bigger heading and then kind of figure out how you're going to address it in terms of being a park? If a place name is used as a subject that has a uniform title or a subordinate body, meaning that it is part of something else, then it is considered a corporate name. And that's just one of those kind of ruly things that exist. For example, we have the Albuquerque, New Mexico Fire Department. So that is going to be, although it has a geographic place there, so it has, Albuquerque, New Mexico, it is really about the fire department. And remember, corporate bodies are a group of people. And so, although it does include a place name, it really is about the fire department. So the place is just sort of associated with it in that way. So what does a geographic name subject added entry look like? Again, the first indicator is blank, so there's nothing assigned for that value. The second indicator follows very much the same as subject headings, topical subject headings. So second indicator, 0 for the Library of Congress subject headings, 1 again for children's literature, 2 that's the National Library of Medicine, so that's your MESH headings, MESH for MESH, and 8 would be your SEER subject headings, which SEERs are often used for children's and then public libraries, things like that. And again, you can have the same sorts of subdivisions. So how do you know if you can subdivide geographically? So can I subdivide geographically that topic? How do you know that? Well, the short answer is maybe. If it's a name, so if it's a person, me, that is one situation where people under the current rules for how we assign subject headings cannot be subdivided geographically. So that just does not happen. So a person may have a name, and in the authority record itself, there may be a place associated with them, but we don't actually assign that place to them in their name. And part of that is because we change so much in terms of places. So, in authority record, we have that one preferred form of a name. So if we were going to assign a place to people, we would have to pick what that place would be. Is it the current place that person lives, or the place they died? Or would you choose the place that they were born? Which place would be the place that would be associated with them? Because any other place would probably be too hard to keep up with, and we constantly be changing authority records. And remember what I've said throughout, when you change authority records, that means there's change or work that has to happen, not only in the authority records themselves, but within your own library catalog and your library data. So we're going to look at some examples of how you can determine if you can subdivide geographically, because that's probably one of the easiest ones to look up. And then we're going to look at it in the Library of Congress's Authorities website, which is authorities.loc.gov, and that's free. We're going to look at it in OCLC. OCLC is a paid service. You have a subscription kind of thing. And then we're going to look at the Library of Congress Link Data Service. And if you work on an institutional repository or a digital library, or maybe you're working with some other ILS, you can actually use the link data service to validate your headings. And we're not going to talk too much about MarcEdit at this point, but I do want to mention MarcEdit as a resource, because you can actually validate your headings in MarcEdit. So you can download a group of records, or you can have a group of records however you've gotten your MARC records. And if you're working with non-MARC records, you can actually use some other tools, and I can share some resources about that tomorrow. But you can use another tool to convert your records into a format that MarcEdit can use, and then you validate them against the MarcEdit link. It's using the link data service to validate the records. It doesn't fix the records, but it will validate the records for you. So I'll share some resources about that tomorrow, because I think that's very useful. So looking in the Library of Congress Authority's website, how do you find out if you can subdivide geographically? Well, the first thing you do is you're just going to search, and you're going to choose what kind of heading you think you're looking for. So if you think you're looking for a subject, or you're looking for a person, you're going to search for what you think you're looking for. You can also use a keyword authorities and search for everything. So if you're just really not sure exactly what you're hoping to find, you can use that. But I will say it's much more successful if you can kind of narrow down, all right, I'm trying to figure out my topic, or I'm trying to figure out, I'm going to check my names to see if my author or my contributor or my performer or illustrator, whatever they are, is in there. So we're going to search for virtual reality in the headings. Subject headings. So we search, and it does pull up quite a few, because it's going to pull up a lot of different things. And you will notice that anytime you see something where it says authorized heading, or if it says here authorized refs and notes, so that means there's 3 different things kind of associated with that. There's some notes on the term virtual reality, there's some references, some cross references, and some authorized terms as well. You notice down here it just says references, virtual reality, augmented reality. So this is just going to be a reference. You'll also see that there are some links to some other things too. There's MESH, there's the Sears list, and then there is the LC children's list. So if you're looking at the LC children's list, you're going to use virtual reality. If you're using the MESH subject headings, you're actually going to capitalize reality. So that would be the difference between the 2 of them. You can also see how many bib records are associated with those particular subject headings in the Library of Congress catalog. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a slice in terms of what you can see there. It's not a full representation, it's going to be a little sliver. So authorized means you're going to be able to see the authority record. When you actually search for things, you can see things like the narrower terms. Remember our NT for narrower terms. The broader terms are not currently available for some reason, but you can normally see the broader terms too, so our BTs. And so that's where you would see the hierarchy. So if you are looking in Classification Web, if you actually pay to use that, you see the hierarchy. Or if you looked in those big red books that used to exist, they're still floating around in some libraries. If you pull those out and look at them, you'll be able to see the hierarchy. How you see the hierarchy here is by looking at your narrower terms, so that would be below virtual reality, or if you're looking at broader terms, that would be the things above it. So you can also look at narrow terms. So you may find out that you have you actually have something about shared virtual environments. And so you may decide that's a better term. Or you may figure, well, no, my term's just kind of an introduction to virtual reality. It's just kind of be about virtual reality in general. So let me look at the scope note, because the scope note's going to tell you how you can use it and give you some guidance on it. So, it tells you your scope note exactly, kind of wordy, but it tells you exactly how you can use it. Here are entered works. So that means what things are cataloged using this term. In theory, if this term is applied correctly, the works here are on entirely digital environments that are experienced by end users. So that's sort of what it's given you. So it's a little bit of a general term, but we kind of know what that means in terms of virtual reality. However, if you have works on environments that layer digital content on top of a physical environment, so if it's something where it's a game or something talking about layering this digital content, this virtual world on top of the physical real world, then they're telling you very clearly that's going to be augmented reality. So if you have that, you're not going to use virtual reality, you're going to use augmented reality. And then there's even a newer term that if you have something that combines physical and digital content and it enables interaction between the real world and digital objects, you're going to use mixed reality. So it kind of clearly, you know, the first one's kind of general, like entirely digital environments that are experienced by end users. Well, experienced is the key part of that, right? That it's something that we experience, a digital world that we experience. But then when you look at the other ones, like how do we experience it? Well, if you experience it and it's both physical and real, then, and it's just layering, so you can't interact with it, then it's going to be augmented reality. If it's real world content and digital content and you can interact with it, it's going to be mixed reality. So it's very important that when you're looking at scope notes, you read them very carefully and kind of parse out the logic of them, because that really will help you. So, you know, when you're looking, you will see your subject heading right there, and you'll see it says 1XX, because that's, you know, the sort of the range of it there, virtual reality. And then it'll also tell you, so see also, those are things that are related to it. And remember, those are the narrower terms that are related to it, but those are terms that are related to it in that hierarchy. When we pull up the record, and one of the nice things about it is you actually get a permalink, so you can actually, you know, share, and you can actually take that permalink and go look at this record if you want to. But you can, you know, share records and all that kind of stuff in terms of looking at records together and things like that if you're working on projects and stuff. What you'll see as your authorized term is in the 150 field, and that is what you would use in an LC subject heading for virtual reality, provided it meets that scope note that we just talked about. So virtual reality. And then down here in your 670, there's some discussion and resources kind of explaining the different terms, you know, sort of parsing out exactly what it means. So there's help down there. And so sometimes if you're not 100% sure, does my book on virtual reality, does it fall into this category? Sometimes if you read these resources in the 670s, those will help you, because in addition to the scope note, what's in the authority record sometimes will actually give you some guidance too, because you'll see down here there's the mixed reality and it kind of goes on in terms of augmented reality and mixed reality, so it kind of gets into it a little bit more. So if the scope notes are confusing, sometimes what you find in the 670s or the resource they cite in the 670s can be useful in terms of sort of following up to determine whether or not that's a useful resource. So can you, from this record, determine if you can subdivide it geographically? The answer is yes. And to do that, you need to know a little bit about those marked positions. So one of the things that we talked about, of course, well, you can see here all the subfield A's show up. So they show up. We also talked about the indicators and the positions of the indicators. And both in a MARC authority record and in a MARC bibliographic record, there is information up here at the top of the record in both of them that is hard-coded information. And some ILSs, this is very much more machine oriented than it is human oriented, because it's not something you can typically just read and know exactly what it is. But if you look in bibliographic formats and standards and you look at MARC authority records, you will see that there's a lot of information telling you exactly what each one of those positions mean. And so positions actually means counting over, and we start with 0. So if you look here, this is in a MARC authority record, and it says character positions 00 to 05. That is the date entered on file. And we're going to look at the record in just a minute, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Then 06 is the next position, and that says whether or not you can divide something geographically. Can you add that geographic subdivision to it? And if there's nothing there, that's not. If you have a D, then you're going to do it in direct order. If you have an I, it's going to be in direct order, and if it's N, it's not applicable, and that would be like for names. That would be like my name. It would have an N. So I'm going to show you exactly how you can see this. You're going to look right after the date of the record creation. It's a lot easier to see this in OCLC than it is to see it in the Library of Congress Authority records, but that's on the website. But I'm telling you, you can see it there. So we're going to look. So we're going to look right after the date of when that record was created. So let's look. So if we go up here to the 008, which is where this is going to be located, and we're going to look here. So position 0, position 1, position 2, position 3, position 4, position 5. That is the date, year, month, date. So this record was created February 18th, 1992. I know it's hard to believe virtual reality was created back then in terms of term. That was when this record was created, when it was first created. I'm sure it's had a lot of work since then. It probably was like virtual worlds or something originally, and now it's virtual reality. So right next to that is an I. So that means, yes, it can be subdivided geographically, and you're going to do it in direct order, which would just mean the sort of the order of how the term's going to be written. So what you really need to know about this is, yes, you can subdivide it geographically, and that means you're going to just look then for your term that you can use. So if you had something about virtual reality in Las Vegas, and it's mostly about virtual reality, a virtual reality conference that happens in Las Vegas, you would have virtual reality, subfield Z, and then you would have Las Vegas, or maybe Nevada, Las Vegas, and then you could even have the year if it's a conference or a date or something like that. So in OCLC, it's a lot easier to see. But like I said, it's the same information. It's just packaged in a different way. So now that you've know that MARC's position-based, you can figure out a whole entire MARC record from top to bottom by using bib formats and standards. You can completely disassemble all that coding and figure it out. And it's pretty amazing to do that, should you want to. But you can also see this in OCLC, and it's much easier to see in OCLC. So OCLC, you just go in and you search your authorities. Once you get there, you'll see here's all this fixed field stuff. So you remember when I said it's like, in our record, we see this because we're seeing it as the MARC record. OCLC parses it out so we can kind of see it in it's more human-oriented. The other thing is, if you're creating a record or if you're not sure what something means, you can actually click on these and it'll tell you what it is. So the geographic subdivision, it's right there. And if you click on it, you'll see N. We see an N right there, and we go down there and N says not applicable. And why is it not applicable? Because we have John Grisham. People can't be subdivided geographically. So that's an easy one to figure out. Looking at the Library of Congress website is a little more complicated. The other place to look is the Library of Congress, the id.loc.gov, which is the linked data service. And you can search all the authority stuff here just as much as you can here. There's also some other cool stuff if you want to look at it. But you can just go in and search. Just search whatever term you want to look for, and you'll get like a whole bunch of stuff. And then when you look over here, you will actually get information that will allow you to break it down a little bit. So you can look at subject headings. You see there's a lot of bib frame kind of stuff there, but you can also see corporate names. So that'd be corporate names that include the phrase virtual reality. There's a conference name, same sort of thing. There'd be some kind of conference on virtual reality. So you can do this where you just kind of, search for your term and then you filter. So that's one way to do it. Or you can actually go in and just search for the subject authority if that's what you want to do. So you kind of have two approaches here, which is really nice. So you can go in and search for subject headings, and that'll kind of filter the list down, and you can see those records that use the virtual reality subject headings, kind of take a look at them. Or you can actually just search for the subject headings to begin with and kind of eliminate all this other stuff. But it kind of depends upon what you want to see. If you want to kind of see a wider range of what you might see, you can do the same thing in OCLC. You can go into OCLC and just search for virtual realities in the subjects and then limit to the Library of Congress records. So limit to a DLC record if you wanted to, and then you'd see what kinds of subject headings they've used for those records. So it's always good to kind of see what our peers are doing. In this case, we pull up the virtual reality subject heading, and you see here where it says collection membership. Well, it is an authorized heading. I mean, we kind of knew that because we've already looked at the subject heading two different places besides this. So it's an authorized heading. And then the other thing that's important to know is that it is part of the may subdivide geographically. So that means you can subdivide it geographically. So that's how they tell you in the linked data service. The other thing you may notice down here is there's suggest alternate terminology. And this is one of the places that just sort of as the general public, you don't have to know somebody who's part of the SACO group working on doing the Library of Congress subject headings or anything like that. You can actually just go through here and do suggest alternate terminology. So you don't have to go through, you still have to go through kind of a special workflow, but it's not quite the same thing. It's a little more general just for the general public. But this is how you see whether or not you can subdivide geographically. And some other things that you can see, you got the same sort of thing. Here we have the scope notes, same sort of information here. We have here our sources. So, this is the same information from the authority record. It's just packaged in a different interface. So we've looked at the same authority record in OCLC, the same authority record at the Library of Congress Authorities website, and now we're looking at the linked data service. One of the nice things I think about the Library of Congress linked data service is that you can also see what other terms are used in some other schemas. So if you're trying to map schemas, if you're trying to match up a Library of Congress subject heading against another schema, then this may be a tool to use for that. So very helpful. So what to do with events and chronological things and events. We're starting to really think about how we're doing events and time span and things like that. So we're going to talk more about that next week. In fact, we're going to talk a lot about that next week. But we're going to talk a little bit about what we're doing now. So, other metadata schemas, like if you use Dublin Core or if you use some other like archival schemas that are out there, they already do events and time spans. That's been sort of from the beginning. Traditional cataloging has not done a lot with time span and events. So we'll talk more about where we're going next week, but we're going to talk right now about how we currently handle events. So festivals, meetings, concerts, we've already talked a little bit about this. Those are handled like a conference. So they're just handled, it's an event. So everything kind of falls into that. And then if you have, people of an event, so this could be like, the festival committee, the fundraising committee associated with the festival, some other group that's associated with the meeting, the committee that's associated with a meeting, the rock concert promoter, all the people and the groups of people that are associated with these things. So it would be, if you a company that is the rock concert promotion company, not a single person. So, any group of people that's associated with these things, they're still going to be treated as a corporate body, and a corporate body being a name. For specific events, they are handled as subjects, and we're going to look at some examples of what specific events are. Specific events usually occur at a single time or are things like a particular war or something like that. So they're going to be big events. They're not going to be a daily event or a small concert or even a concert. Typically, they're going to be kind of a big event to be a subject. And that's really up to the cataloger who's cataloging a work about a particular event. If it is a big enough event, and they propose a subject heading, the subject heading is accepted, then it will become an option to use it as a subject heading. But that's one of those things that it just kind of goes through the process. So not every event is going to qualify or even be considered to be a subject. And it really has to do with how big it is and how important it is, and even whether or not it reoccurs and things like that. There's a lot of things that kind of go into whether or not it qualifies to kind of get its own subject. So for now, there's not that many events that have their own subject. It really is sort of the biggies. A time period as a whole is represented as a subject or by a chronological subdivision. Again, that has to do with whether or not it is mostly about the time, history of the 20th century, or if it's mostly about something else, and then the time is, politics in the 20th century. It's mostly about politics, but it's within that time period. So you always think about, what is it mostly about? What's the most important topic? So looking at some examples, and so we're looking at a bibliographic record. So this is about the Lilith Fair. And so this is given a subject heading, Lilith Fair, because of course that was kind of a big event. This is an example, and there's a lot of examples kind of floating around in here, but we'll just kind of go through a couple of them. So we have here, this is the Civil War, and so the Civil War, this is actually a book that's a book of diary. So it's the James Fulton, who was a U.S. Civil War surgeon. And so this is his name authority. So this, his name authority is Fulton James, and then subfield C, which is U.S. Civil War surgeon. So when we have names that are very common, one of the things that we can do now is we can add the place, the profession that a person is associated with, to sort of separate out from the other James Fulton. So we have, he's Fulton James, U.S. Civil War surgeon, and this is his book of diaries. And so this is almost like a biography, where we're talking about a person's work. So it's about him, it's his diaries. And of course, then we have some other things associated with him. This is diaries being in during the Civil War, and so we are looking at his relationship to the Army, and so where he was, which Army he was located in when he wrote this diary. And so kind of thinking about all the things that we can cover looking at this diary. And then we have here in the 610, we have a fast heading, and that's just we talked about that a little bit earlier. It's that simplified version of Library of Congress subject headings. But you see here we have that second indicator 7, which indicates that it's a fast heading, but then we also, or an alternate vocabulary, but we also then define it in a subfield 2. And so you'll notice when you're looking at a lot of MARC records, if you see a subfield 2 at the end, it's defining what vocabulary or terminology that particular work is coming from. And then of course we also have down here the Civil War as a time period, and so we have added that as a chronological heading under United States history, and then we've added in medical care, because this is really sort of that bigger, you have a good sense of what this particular work's about just from the various headings. So when you have something that covers a time period, you have to kind of look at what is it about mostly, and then figure out how to work the time period within that. And it can be useful, especially when you're looking at things related to war or the military, to kind of look at other works that might be in OCLC and kind of see what people are doing. So here's an example, another example. This is a subject heading for an event. And so this is the San Francisco earthquake and fire in California in 1906. And actually, if you click on any of these blue links, it will take you over to a subject heading. Now, or or a name heading. Now for the San Francisco earthquake and fire, California 1906, that's about one particular event. So if you click on this, it will actually take you directly over to that. Earthquakes, California, San Francisco history, depend on exactly how that's formatted. It's not going to take you all the way over to all of that. So 655 genre terms, we talked a little bit about this in our previous classes. There is a list. We've already talked about the list. Subfield A, again, subfield A may be missing from that mark field that you may see there. It's just going to be hidden. It's not really missing, it's just hidden because it's a default coding. But the subfield 2 is the source. And so that's telling you that's actually the abbreviation for the the genres and form description. So it's actually telling you what the list is for that. Looking at another example of chronological events, another bib record. This is the Battle of Shiloh. And again, this was a specific incident, and so it has its own subject heading associated with it. This is a film, so they didn't really do a lot with subject headings. They just kind of, and when you look at it, it really talks about sort of the battle and it gets into a little bit more of that, but it doesn't really tell you exactly much about the troops. You do have a commander listed here, but it doesn't really tell you too much about how that actually plays into this film. So we might have been able to add a little bit more in here because we have a couple more names and things like that. So we might have been able to add a little bit more information into that. But we've covered the basics, at least with Shiloh, because that's the battle. And then, of course, we have then information about it because it is a movie. So anytime you have AV or literature, you're going to be more likely to use this genre headings, and you may use more genre headings than you actually do in terms of subject headings. Could have been a little bit more in here in terms of some subjects. So, looking at things in an OPAC, same sort of thing. So those subject headings just, come right up in our list when we're searching. And then names, as we kind of round up here at the end, names is subject. We've already talked about names quite a bit, but they can be a creator or participant, really any role in a work. And then, of course, they can be a subject of a work. And that's what we're going to spend the most amount of time talking about tonight. I wanted to kind of give you some new terminology because this is terminology we'll talk a little bit more about next week. Persons, of course, we've already talked about people. People are part of a class called agents. So this is some new sort of authority terminology for people. And people are defined as human beings that contribute to a work. Corporate body is still the same thing. Has nothing to do with whether or not people make money. But it is part of a larger group called collective agent. So one of the things we started looking at as we started looking at authorities is that, of course, we had persons being a single person, and then groups, any group of people working together, so corporate body. And then we had families, which is a group defined as a family. And this is either by themselves or by a legal standing. So, it's a very loose definition of what family means. And so one of the things we started looking at was whether or not there was a term that we could use to sort of pull together all groups of people, families and corporate body. And so that sort of this notion of collective agent came about. If you've worked with other metadata schemas, or you've worked with anything out in the web world, you may be aware of like identity management and this talk about agents as people and things like that. So we're starting to kind of look at that in terms of what we are doing too. So names, if the work being cataloged is about a person or a place or a corporate body, then a name heading is appropriate. So, anytime you have something about a person or a place or a corporate body, the name heading is appropriate. Personal names, a biography will have a subject heading for the person who the biography is written about. And then family names are coded as personal names. So they still have, they fall under family. So they fall under that family catalog, but they are actually put together according to subject cataloging rules. Now, if you're not doing authority work where you're creating the authority record, then that's probably not that important to you, but it's just a thing to kind of be aware of, that when um, you look at how family names are constructed, they will look like a subject, but they will fall into that family name category. So looking at a couple of records, and we're going to talk a little bit more about examples. We have here Prince's authority record. Of course, this is a MARC authority record. And again, subfield A's are missing, so you don't see any of the subfield A's that would be here. Well, you see 1, 2, but you don't see any at the beginning, so those are all missing, but they're there. But you see Prince, that's the official form of his name. If you look down here in the 400 fields, you see the various variations of their names he has used. And then, of course, you see up here that we have a call number assigned for him. So for some subjects and many people, not all people, but many people, if they create music or they create literature, or sometimes art, that would be the other category, but not always art, but literature and music, if they create literature and music and they have created a few works, then they will typically have their own number assigned to them. So if you were cataloging something by Prince, then you were going to catalog something that was a biography of Prince, so it's telling you here this is his biography number. Then if you're going to catalog a biography of Prince, then you would start with this number, this call number, and then you would add to it. If you were cataloging music, you're going to put it in the M's, and you're going to put him into that contemporary category. But if you're doing a biography, you would start with this ML420 number. So when we look at sort of looking at the OPAC version, we've gotten kind of, I think the call number got squished off here. But when you look down here, you can see actually down here at the bottom that we can see the subject and the subject, geographic terms, and then there's the form terms. And then of course down here we see there's the official form of his name because this is a biography of him. And then there's the form subdivision that is juvenile literature. So looking at this, sort of the back side of that, looking at the MARC side of that, and again, now this one actually shows the pound signs for the blank delimiters, and it also shows the subfield A's. So you see those all in this one. This is the same record we were just looking at here, but you see here we have rock musicians, and then subfield Z, United States. Sometimes the spaces get all squished up in the display. And then you can see down here we have our subject and our geographical subdivision and our form subdivision. And then we have our genre here. So families, 2 or more persons related by birth, marriage, adoption, civil unit, or similar legal status, or who otherwise present themselves as a family. So that's the definition by RDA. They can be a creator or contributor. Under AACR 2, which was our older cataloging rules, they are only treated as a subject. So now they can be either the creator or contributor, or they can be a subject. So they can be either of those, just like any single person name is. So this is one of the things that is a little bit, if you've been working with historical material, or maybe you've been doing some research, and you'll notice that like families are kind of, the records are kind of weird. So it might be written about a family, written by the family, but it's just kind of weird in terms of how it's done. So we would not have put there would not be a 100 field for a family. They could only be a subject. So subject authority records continue, but those are for general family groupings. So if you have like a specific family, like for example, we have this particular family that was active from 1816 to 1903 in Holt, Sweden, and they are this family branch is the one that pulled together all of these family papers and published them. In olden days, we would not have been able to give them credit in that way for it. We would have just put Anderson family as a subject. And that's really all we would be able to do from it. And also there's a reference to say like Anderson with 2 S's versus 1 Anderson. So there's a reference to that in the authority file. But we wouldn't have been able to actually give them credit and give them that 100 field, that authorized form of a family for that specific family branch. We would just sort of said like, oh, it's about the Anderson family, and that's it. So it's nice that we're able to give people a little bit more credit as far as families. So here's an example. It's the Chapman family in South Carolina. They do a family reunion chronicle. You can note some of the punctuation. It's kind of stuck all in here, so it's pretty easy to kind of see dashes and periods and the semicolons. That's all and the colons and the commas. That's all the ISB punctuation. But the more important part of it, this is the Chapman's Family Chronicle, and it's Dr. Emmanuel D. Chapman is the one who publishes it. And this is a little bit of an early Mark RDA record. So there's still the 260 in there, but that's acceptable. But the important part of it is that it's published by a particular member of the family. And this is, of course, a family reunion periodical, that's put together by the whole family. And so, but it's the family in South Carolina that actually does it. So we're able to give them their own authorized access point for the family in South Carolina. And then we're able to give them a more general Chapman family, but this really applies to all Chapman family members internationally. So, I mean, it's not like it's just, that one particular. But from a genealogical standpoint, one can say, if you're a Chapman in South Carolina, you're a member of the larger Chapman family. You could make that. I know some of you are like, what? That can't possibly be. And, I guess somewhere eventually people are related. But that's sort of the best approach we have at this point. It's still not probably as defined as it needs to be in terms of families because it's for subject, it's at that general level. Not my rule. So titles. Works about other works that have subject headings that consist of a catalog entry for the work being discussed. For example, we have Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind, or we have a uniform title, which would be like Beowulf. We already talked about uniform titles, but just kind of reminded you that titles can exist. This is an example of a title record for Hawaii Five-0, the television program, the original, the best one. From 1968 to 1980. And, that's just sort of what a title record looked like. So if you're cataloging something about that show, maybe someone was writing a critique or a comparison of that show, then you could use that heading, to reference that work. I already talked about the relationship between the call number and the subject heading. So anytime you see a call number in an authority record, you should take a look at it and carefully consider it. If you have a person like John Grisham or any author really, if they are an author who is writing fiction, the call number that will be listed for them is most likely going to be the call number that will be used for them. There may be times that they write in some other category. If John Grisham starts writing nonfiction, then his nonfiction would be shelved in the nonfiction according to the subject and not shelved with his fiction work. So there may be some times when that call number is not going to be exactly the call number that would be used for that particular person, but it really depends upon what they're writing. But that is his call number for his work of fiction. So when you have a call number for a work of, say for a work of fiction, then it's at this point, we have the call number for John Grisham. And at this point, the next cutter would be for the title of the work. And that's just sort of the rule in terms of cutting. So to wrap up, you're going to follow your thesaurus instructions. And then you're always going to, make sure to be careful when you're looking at records in OCLC. Just don't assume that it's the correct subject headings or that any subdivisions for any thesaurus are used correctly. So just to be careful. And then on that note, I'm not going to go through the resources, but you'll have the resources. There are a lot of resources here. I've pulled together some of the ones we've looked at earlier. And then also some of the rules of 2s and 3s for you to look at, which we've already talked about. And also then towards the end of here, there's also lots of MARC resources for you to take a look at. So lots of resources that you can take a look at. And on that note, I'm just going to finish up here and say goodnight and thank you.